As we look at this image of a lovely coral reef, we can see that it is a complex ecosystem of not just the coral animals themselves, and yes, corals are animals, but also many organisms that attach to the coral reef, and the fish swimming around the reef. What kind of animals are these? What are the relationships between them? Also, all animals need to eat. Where are they getting their food? We'll try to answer these questions today as we explore the basics of marine ecology. Before we begin, here are some learning outcomes for today's lesson. As you work through the material and practice in class, come back and review to see if you've accomplished these goals. You should not only be able to define new terms, but also apply them to specific organisms, and also identify the relationships between the organisms in a marine ecosystem. Let's start first by defining what types of organisms live in the ocean. If you ask most people to list types of life, they might list plants and animals. But in reality, there's only two small categories of life, and there are many more. One of the most fundamental distinctions we can make is between life forms that are composed of a single cell and those that are composed of more than one. Single-celled life forms are usually very tiny, so they're easy to overlook and might not even be visible without a microscope. So while we tend to think of marine animals like sharks when we think about life in the ocean, in reality, the vast majority of life forms in the ocean are neither animals nor multicelled, and are groups you've probably never heard of, like this foraminiferan on the left. It is neither a plant nor an animal, but a member of a group called the protozoans, which are all single-celled and are very abundant in the ocean. Most of us learned in school about how plants photosynthesize, so we tend to think of plants when we think of photosynthesis. But while there are some marine plants, like the seagrass on the left, most organisms that photosynthesize in the ocean are not plants at all, but members of a number of groups of single-celled organisms, such as the single-celled box-like diatoms on the right. Each of these is an independent organism comprising a single cell, despite the fact that the cells are attached to each other. Cells can be simple or complex. The most simple type of cell is called a prokaryote. This type of cell has genetic material, but this material is not contained within a nucleus. It also has a rather inflexible cell wall and does not have specialized structures within the cell. All prokaryotic organisms are single-celled. Even though they sometimes attach to each other to form colonies, each cell is a separate organism. In contrast, eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus that houses their DNA. Their cell wall is more flexible, and they have specialized structures within their cell, like mitochondria and plastids. While many eukaryotic organisms are single-celled as well, eukaryotes include the multicelled forms of life, including animals, plants, and fungi. Both prokaryotes and eukaryotes, single-celled and multicelled, are important members of the marine ecosystem. Let's next turn our attention to where in the ocean these organisms are living. Life would be pretty different for a shark swimming around in the water than it would be for seagrass attached to the seafloor. If I ask you to make a list of things that live in the ocean, you'd probably list bigger exotic animals like sharks, dolphins, sea turtles, and maybe even seahorses. But most animals in the ocean aren't capable of deliberately swimming from place to place like a sea turtle. Instead, they go wherever the current takes them, either because they aren't strong swimmers, or perhaps they don't swim at all but merely float. These tiny shrimp have legs, so can swim, but they are so tiny, at about 2 millimeters long, that they cannot swim against the current. Any organism that falls into this category is a member of the plankton, whether it is an animal or not. The animals that can swim against the currents are members of the nekton. While much more visible, this group of organisms is much less abundant in the ocean than the usually much smaller plankton. Animals that live on the seafloor are called the benthos. Some of them just sit on the seafloor, but others attach to the seafloor like these mussels that were photographed near midocean ridge. And some dig into the seafloor instead, like clams, which are a close relative of these mussels. All of these are ways to be members of the benthos. We can also make a distinction between the organisms that are living in what we call the water column, meaning the water between the sea surface and the sea floor, and those that spend all or most of their lives on the seafloor itself. The former are what we call pelagic organisms, and the latter are what we call benthic organisms. Here's a question to think about. Pause the video if you'd like to think about it for a little bit. The question asks, are all members of the benthos benthic? The only difference here is that benthos is a noun that refers to a group of marine organisms that spends their lives on the seafloor, and benthic is an adjective that we can use to describe them. Here's another question to think about. Pause the video if you'd like to think about it for a little bit. Which organisms are pelagic? When we use the adjective pelagic, we're referring to organisms that spend their lives in the water between the sea surface and the sea floor. So that includes both the plankton and the nekton. Let's make sure you understand these three terms before we move on. Examine the marine organisms shown in the pictures and match up the terms to the pictures. Pause the video while you complete this task. Picture 1 is of a shark. The shark is a strong swimmer that spends most of its time in the water column, so it is a member of the nekton, B. Photo 2 shows us a conch, a type of marine snail. It crawls around the seafloor looking for other snails to eat. So it is a member of the benthos, C. And figure 3 shows us a jellyfish, which floats with the currents. So it is a member of the plankton, A. Now let's think about how organisms feed in the ocean. We call these trophic strategies. The root word for trophic means nourishment, or food. As I mentioned earlier, most people would only name plants and animals if asked to describe different types of life. Let's think about the difference between the two. Plants use energy from the sun to combine carbon dioxide and water to make a sugar molecule, organic carbon. They can do this because they have a pigment in their cells called chlorophyll. They also need certain elements that we call inorganic nutrients. We'll talk about them in a later lesson. We call organisms like plants that make their own food autotrophs, meaning self-feeding. But as we previously discussed, most autotrophs in the ocean are not plants. Animals, on the other hand, use oxygen, a byproduct of photosynthesis, to break the organic carbon molecule apart. They use the energy released, and carbon dioxide and water are also eventually released. To a certain extent, that's what's happening when you exhale. We call organisms like animals heterotrophs, meaning other feeding. Autotrophs are responsible for what we call primary productivity. This concept is probably easier to visualize if we think about what happens on land. Ultimately, our food, which provides us with energy, comes from plants. This corn might be turned into tortilla chips, or it might be fed to a cow, which then ends up being your lunchtime hamburger. The same system of energy being distributed from the primary producers into the rest of the ecosystem happens in the ocean as well, even though it is more likely to be single-celled organisms that are producing the energy rather than these corn plants. The majority of the primary producers that live in the ocean are single-celled organisms like the ones seen under the microscope here. Despite being very tiny, in some circumstances they can be so abundant that they color the water green and can be seen from space, as we see in the satellite image to the right. Photosynthesizers are photoautotrophs, meaning that they require energy from the sun to be autotrophs. So knowing what we know about photosynthesis, what is the major limitation of photoautotrophy in the ocean environment? Several limitations exist, including the need for inorganic nutrients, but the major limitation is the need for sunlight. Photoautotrophs can't photosynthesize without it, yet most of the ocean is deep and dark, with no available sunlight. In the ocean, photosynthesis is only possible where the sunlight is available, because energy from the sun is needed to break the strong bonds of the water molecule. In clear ocean water, this is usually at 200 meters and above. Below 200 meters, there is a zone where there might be enough light for the animals to just barely see each other, but it's not enough for photosynthesis. And once you get past 1,000 meters, no sunlight is present at all. If the ocean water is muddy, then the bottom boundary of the photic zone will be even closer to the sea's surface. But there's another possibility for being an autotroph, one that you've probably never heard of, and one that scientists have only known about for about 50 years. This is called chemoautotrophy. This process uses hydrogen sulfide in place of water. This molecule is easier to break down, so energy from the sunlight is not needed, just a steady supply of hydrogen sulfide molecules. This is a process that can happen deep within the ocean. You might remember that midocean ridges are divergent plate boundaries where volcanic activity happens regularly. Even when volcanic activity is not happening, the rocks there are very hot, and we get a lot of hydrogen sulfide released. It is used by chemosynthetic organisms, chemoautotrophs, to support an entire community of organisms based on this primary productivity. In the picture, we see something called a smoker, which is releasing hydrogen sulfide along with other compounds and materials. The smokers are places where really hot water is being released into the ocean. The water seeped into the midocean ridge through cracks in the rocks. It got heated up, and as it heated, compounds, including hydrogen sulfide, were dissolved into it from the surrounding rocks. Once the super hot water goes back into the ocean through the smoker, it has lots of chemicals dissolved in it. So why do the smokers smoke? What you're seeing is not smoke at all, but tiny bits of mineral material that are forming as the water cools down quickly. Some of the dissolved compounds start to react with each other to form solids as the water quickly cools down. Depending on which minerals are forming, the smoke may be black or white, giving us white smokers and black smokers. Both of these are also referred to as hydrothermal vents. Instead of plants in the communities around mid-ocean ridge hydrothermal vents, we find microbial mats. As you can see in the picture, the heterotrophs are busy feeding on it. One really weird animal that we often find in chemosynthetic supported marine communities is the tube worm. Tube worms are indeed a form of worm that surround themselves with a hardened tube for protection. Like all animals, they are heterotrophs, but they do not have a gut for digestion. Instead, they have chemoautotrophs living inside their tissues. They are able to take in and transport the hydrogen sulfide to the chemoautotrophs, which then produce organic carbon, some of which provides nutrients for the tube worm. A relationship like this, which represents a close relationship between two organisms, is called a symbiotic one. Once scientists discovered chemosynthesis, they were surprised to find that communities like this are quite common along midocean ridges. But a few decades later, they discovered that chemosynthesis does not just happen in the hot volcanic areas of the midocean ridges. This type of community can also be found in places where the gas methane is accumulating on the seafloor. In the cold, deep parts of the ocean, methane gas plus water forms an ice-like substance. Even though it looks like ice, it's actually a cage of water molecules surrounding a methane molecule, which is CH4. In the smaller figure, the green and gray molecule is the methane, and the gray and red ones are the water molecules. So even though it looks like ice, it will burn as shown in the figure because methane gas is very flammable. So where did the methane come from? Some of it is from the activity of organisms. For instance, when you digest food, you produce methane gas. But some of it is seeping to the surface from oil and natural gas deposits in rocks far below the surface. The methane often also has hydrogen sulfide associated with it, and both gases can be used for chemosynthesis. These areas are referred to as cold seeps. They are very cold as compared to the midocean ridge hydrothermal vents. These cold seeps are especially common in areas where the oil and natural gas trapped in rocks beneath the surface migrates upwards along natural fractures in the rocks called faults. Where these faults intersect the seafloor, the constantly escaping gases provide the chemicals needed for chemosynthesis. Like the hydrothermal vent communities, sometimes these cold seep communities look like something from outer space. Here we see an ice-like blob of gas hydrate. Microbial mats are using the gas trapped within the ice for chemosynthesis, and these pink ice worms are feeding on the microbial mats. These ice worms live only in chemosynthetic communities, despite being heterotrophs. Just like at midocean ridges, we often find vast thickets of tube worms, as seen here in the Gulf of Mexico. The ice worms and the tube worms only live in chemosynthetic communities, but because there is such an abundance of life here, organisms that are not confined just to chemosynthetic communities show up as well, like the shark seen swimming through the tube worms. Let's return for a few minutes to the terms used earlier to describe how organisms live in the ocean. We distinguish nekton, which swim strongly, and plankton, which don't. But both are considered pelagic organisms because they live in the water column, whereas organisms that live on the seafloor are the benthos. So let's particularly explore trophic strategies among the plankton, which are by far the most abundant organisms in the ocean. We've already talked multiple times about how most of the photosynthesis in the ocean is carried out by single-celled organisms like the diatom here on the left. They are members of what we call the phytoplankton. Zooplankton is a term for multi- or single-celled eukaryotes that are heterotrophic. Many of them are animals, or multi-celled eukaryotes like this tiny marine snail, but some zooplankton are single-celled eukaryotes and are therefore not classified as animals, even though they are heterotrophic. Phytoplankton like zooplankton can be single-celled like this diatom, or multi-celled like this floating algae called sargassum. Unlike the zooplankton, which only include the eukaryotes, not the prokaryotes, the group phytoplankton includes photosynthesizing prokaryotes, the oldest photosynthesizing group on our planet. So while most of the zooplankton we might think of, like jellyfish, are animals, the group includes single-celled organisms like this foraminiferan, which is a protozoan. Despite being a single cell, some of them can actually prey on very small multi-celled zooplankton, like the copepod shown here, which is a crustacean, the group that also includes shrimps and lobsters. So we specifically excluded the prokaryotes from the group that we call zooplankton. So where do we put them? We refer to this group as the bacterial plankton. The bacterial plankton are easy to overlook, but they are really important parts of the marine community. As they scavenge and metabolize organic matter, they are responsible for its breakdown and the release of CO2 and inorganic nutrients back into the water. The decay of dead organic material is undertaken by the bacterial plankton in the pelagic realm. Alright, so I've learned a bunch of terms, and it's important to know their definitions, but it's even more important to be able to apply them. Let's do a few practice problems, and if you have trouble, you might want to go back to review. Here is a lovely but small jellyfish. Which of these two terms apply? The jellyfish spends its time in the water column, not on the seafloor, so we consider it to be pelagic. Which of these two terms apply? The jellyfish is an animal, so it is a heterotroph. What about these two terms? I mentioned that it was a rather small jellyfish, so even though it can swim, it can't swim against the current, so we classify it as a member of the plankton. Which of these terms apply? As a heterotrophic animal, it is a member of the zooplankton, a subdivision of the larger group plankton. Here we have all the terms in a list. See if you can figure out which terms apply to this particular marine organism. This is a dolphin, which is an animal. We know that it is a eukaryote because it is multicelled, and only eukaryotes can be multicelled. We know that it swims strongly, so it is also a member of the nekton. It spends its life swimming around, so therefore is pelagic. It is heterotrophic. We know this because it is an animal, and all animals are heterotrophic, even if we haven't watched videos of dolphins eating fish. Here's a coral reef picture that we discussed at the beginning of the class. Hopefully now we are better able to imagine how these organisms are living in the marine environment, and what their relationships with each other might be. Pause the video if you would like to think about the question. Both the fish and the corals are animals, which means that they are multicelled heterotrophs. They are dependent on the autotrophs for food. Obviously, with this much life, there must be a lot of photosynthesis going on, but we don't see any plants. So the primary productivity for this community is the phytoplankton, which are not visible in the picture. Although interestingly, many coral animals house single-celled photosynthetic organisms within their tissues, which also contributes to the primary productivity of coral reefs. Here's another very different looking community. This community doesn't include corals, but there's still a lot of life here, including fish not shown. So what's fundamentally different here in how the community is structured? Pause the video if you'd like to think about it. Our clue here is the black smoke or hydrothermal vent. This is a feature that we would find at a midocean ridge, far, far below the depth to which sunlight can penetrate. So photosynthesis is impossible here, but we still have a thriving community. Primary productivity in this community is chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. In class, we're going to play a game where you will need to read a description of an organism, and you will figure out which of all the terms we just learned apply to that organism. You don't have to figure out what they are, but it's more fun if you do.